Good evening and welcome tonight on the lecture titled The Clean, the Dirty and the Hybrid, Ecofeminist Art Practices, a lecture by Suzana Milevska. My name is Biljana Tanurovska-Tulavkovski, and tonight together with a colleague Agnes Quackels from Kai Theater, we will give short introduction of the program, in which context we're holding this lecture, and briefly we'll introduce Suzana. However, after this lecture, just to say, we will have possibilities for questions and answers, so please leave your questions in the Facebook stream page. Tonight's lecture is a part of collaborative program of Lokomotiva and Kai Theater in frame of Project Art Climate Transition, and Agnes will give short explanation about it. And just briefly to introduce how we came to this subject and invitation of Suzana, Agnes and myself discussed a lot about common interests regarding this program, and we came to the ecofeminism as a subject that we wanted to explore, thus knowing that Suzana was part of one conference which dealt with this subject, but also being a mentor to students studying ecofeminism and herself being busy with researching it in the last period. We were delighted to invite her to start and to share her latest findings, questions, dilemmas tonight as part of this lecture. And I will briefly say a few words about Suzana. I will not read her biography. You can find it on the introduction of this lecture, and Suzana has an impressive biography, and just I would like to say that she is a curator, a theorist of visual art and culture, and her theoretical and curatorial interests include post-colonial and feminist critique of representational regimes of hegemonic power in arts and visual culture, and collaborative and participatory art practices in marginalized communities. So Agnes, please, if you can come with your introduction.
Thank you, Biljana. I'm very happy to be here tonight together with you in Lokomotiva Skopje to host this lecture by Suzana Milevska. And we are doing this in the frame of this European network called ACT. And I will say just a few words about it to sort of frame a bit this collaboration. So the name ACT stands for Art, Climate and Transition. The network is supported in the frame of the program Creative Network, Creative Europe, and it is made of 10 partners spread around Europe, Slovenia, Netherlands, Croatia, Latvia, UK, Germany, France, Portugal, North Macedonia, and Belgium. And these partners are all art centers of various forms and size, and all with various missions. But they are all also, among many other things, working around the theme of climate urgency and social justice. And this is the reason why they gathered and created this network. And it is called ACT because mainly what we try to do is to instigate change, but also action through arts. The main activity of this network is to produce, present, and support artistic projects that are working around and with the theme of a just transition. And most of those projects are taking place on stage, but the network is also providing the possibility to develop more discursive formats across Europe and supported by several partners, as for example, the format we call relay lectures. And this is actually the frame in which we have worked tonight for this lecture tonight. So relay lecture is actually tonight we have this lecture that has been organized by Lokomotiva on the basis of conversation we had together, and it's hosted by them, but also streamed on the social media of Kai Theater in Belgium. And later this year, we at Kai Theater, we will propose another lecture as a sort of an answer or a continuation of today's Suzana lecture. And this one will also be streamed on the social media of Lokomotiva 10. Voila, so stay tuned, and I think I can give you the word back, Biljana. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. Just to say that we are supported by a Creative Europe program and also the Ministry of Culture of Republic of North Macedonia. So yes, and we are finished with the introduction, and I would like to invite Suzana to take the floor. Please, Suzana.
Hi, I'm so glad to be with you wherever you are, both Skopje, Brussels, and elsewhere. I'm very happy to get invited to such a complex program. And I must say that it was also a kind of challenge, a motivation for me to address this topic that I am familiar with, but I haven't done uh, uh, kind of substantial work about that. Can we have the slides, please? So my lecture for tonight is called The Clean, the Dirty, the Hybrid, which is, I guess you caught the pun of words. Of course, it refers to all this discourse about the clean or dirty environment, and also how to get away, how to overcome it with the hybrid vehicles. It's just a plan. You'll see the lecture itself is not really about renewable energy or whatever. It's more about, as I know, as you notice in the title, about ecofeminist art practices. Next slide. Perhaps you saw this image on the social media, glacier comparison, which is actually consists of two images, and it's a series of photographs by Christian Oslund and for Greenpeace, and it's an image that in a way proves the urgency of the topic for tonight. Ecology and environment. I don't have to spend too many words. It's visible. These two images are taken with 100 years apart of each other, and you can see Arctic, how it changed. In the second image, which was done in 2003, there is almost no ice at all. So this is in a way proof not that we need it for the urgency of tonight's lecture, but of course I must somehow be very honest to share with you my previous feelings and knowledge about ecology and ecofeminism. Next slide. Uh, this lecture comes in a way very late. I come late in this party about talking about ecofeminism because I was, as many women, trained in art history and philosophy of art that was mainly masculine. And whatever I was reading in 1990s, and especially books and magazines or journals on philosophy, were written by men. This that you can read, the insert, was one of the rare uh, inserts that comes from the journal and from the book on philosophy and the natural environment that I came across in the National and University Library with help of my very good friend Senka Nomoska, who was working at that time at the University Library. So I could get the latest journals and text. So let's read this. There is something subjective, philosophically naive, and even something hazardous in a time of ecological crisis about living in a reference frame where one species takes itself as absolute and values everything else in nature relative to its potential to produce value for itself. Why I'm reading this? This was one of the rare texts that stayed in my mind, that somehow questioned at that time the dominant discourse about ecology, which was mainly in a way mourning or whining about the loss of our nature, of our resources, without any critical thinking about that. It's something that actually much later, more recently, was addressed in philosophy and the theory, and it was criticized as Anthropocene, as a term that is likely here to stay, but it's so much criticized as a kind of uh, centralist discourse about nature and ecology. And this is what somehow prevented me from really, as I said, come to the party much earlier. But now with this recent criticism of the early kind of a discourse of ecology and environment, in a way I felt uh, drawn to this discourse again. Next slide. Next slide. So in this lecture, I will talk about ecofeminism. I will give some short introduction to cultural and radical or social ecofeminism. I will talk a little bit about the background of ecofeminism, and of course, I will discuss ecofeminist art, the main topics, and few examples. Next slide. Next slide. You will see all these topics actually will be somehow interwoven, intertwined in my lecture. I will talk about feminism, climate change, LGBTQI rights, intersectionality between gender, race, sexuality, class, and equal distribution of space, ecofeminism, care and motherhood, through the eyes of post-Marxist critique, and commoning, but with this in the center of all these topics will be, of course, patriarchy, which ecofeminism obviously has problems with. In next slide, in different world cultures, actually the patriarchal regimes of representation have long interpreted women as obsessed with cleaning and purification, precisely because of the anthropologically driven negative representation of women as dirty. The stereotypical image of domestic goddess in a way resulted of the impossible and never-ending task as a kind of punishment to overcome the taboos of pollution and secular defilement. There was many conferences dealing with this. The conference that Biljana Tamurovska mentioned in the introduction took place in Vienna just before the pandemic started, and it dealt with this uneven, unequal distribution of spaces in architecture and urban places. It took place in the Technical University in Vienna, and it was very much informed by ecofeminism. There was a panel which I participated and led, and some of this on the right hand part of the slide, some of these topics and books were discussed in full length. Helen Frico was there, and she informed in a way this lecture. Her book on dirt informed this lecture, and I actually am in debt to her. Also, I'm in very good collaboration with my ex-student who defended one of the most complex PhD about ecology, which was defended on the same faculty. Next slide. So I'm talking tonight about topics that are actually feminist topics, like purity and danger that comes from the famous Mary Douglas book, which addressed very early in the 60s already the asymmetrical relation between anthropology, patriarchy, and ecology. Where unraveled all these contradictions became unviable ever since. As did the dichotomization of the concepts of the clean and the pure on the one hand, and the dirty on the other hand. And this I find very important, relevant for today's lecture and for today's ecofeminist discourse, because you see all these contradictions between the women understood as dirty and as at the same time as responsible for making the earth and the planet clean. So all these contradictions somehow driven this lecture, informed this lecture. The female pollution as a societal and anthropological concept related to the general fear from dirt as danger coming from the feminine side. But of course, we know that women are responsible for keeping not only the household, but the whole planet clean. And these contradictions between feminine and masculine were in a way in the background of the emergence of ecofeminist discourse. Tonight, I will try also to present some art practices of women artists who mounted ecofeminism as a critical frame that not only offers environmental awareness, but also aims to deconstruct the contentious assumptions that dwell on stereotypical and patriarchal hierarchical understanding of women creativity and productivity. Next slide. So we came to the ecofeminism as a term. It's ever since the early 1970s, many feminists, especially ecological feminists, have defended the assumption that the environment is a feminist issue. But ecofeminism was not the only term that was used at the beginning. Ecological feminism was a term that was coined by Karen Warren, feminist environmentalism by Seeger, social ecofeminism by Helen King, critical feminist eco-socialism. So the question is why I'm using ecofeminism as a term. All these different debates within ecofeminism in a way sounded to me as a kind of policing during the history of ecofeminism. And I decided to use this term as umbrella term that would address all these different fractions and streams of ecofeminism. But nevertheless, many feminists have argued that the goals of these two movements and all these different topics and names are mutually reinforcing. Ultimately, they involve the development of worldviews and practices that are not based on male-biased models of domination. So that is what all these different ecofeminist discourses have in common. Ecofeminism, you can read from my slide, is a kind of a very simplified definition, is a practical and logical response to the reality of environmental degradation. Ecofeminists see a correlation between the general status of women and society and the exploitation of the environment. So it's really not only about restoration of nature as one would think. The dominance which men have assumed over Earth is reflected in the relation, dialectical relation between men and women. Next slide. The word ecofeminism was coined very early in, next slide, in 1974 by the French theorist François Dubon in her book Feminism or Death. She somehow had this notion that women have unique relationship to nature grounded in their intuitive ethic of caring and preserving. In her book, she argued that the struggle of women's liberation was inherently anti-imperialistic. So you can see here already two different very important concepts that later on were taken aboard by ecofeminists. Of course, the Marxist background of her thinking, and also something that sparked lots of different conflicts, which sounds a little bit essentialistic. So I will talk about this during my presentation. Different ecofeminists, the next slide, are agreed that since the domination of women and the domination of nature have occurred in the same societal registry, women have and had a particular stake in ending the domination over nature. Both feminism and ecofeminism stand for an egalitarian, non-hierarchical system, and this is what really brings together ecology and feminism. Can we have the next slide? And next slide. Ecofeminism claims that both women and nature are dominated and thus stresses the need for a more interdependent worldview. Ecofeminists believe that all living things are essential to the well-being of the planet and that humans are not separate or superior. And this is exactly what this early text that I've read somehow announced, anticipated, and I'm so grateful for this critique of the usual anthropocentric view of the world that many male philosophers share. More emphasis, according to ecofeminists, could be placed and should be placed on the role consumers have played in environmental destruction. And you can read here in the background this Marxist critique of environmental destruction. Within next slide, within feminism, a locus of scholars believe that a historical, symbolic, and theoretical connection exists between domination of nature and women. I will list here 4 different aspects of these 4 different principles. There are vital connections between the oppression of nature and women. This is what brought together ecologists and feminists. Understanding these connections is necessary to understand the 2 veins of oppression. Feminist theory must include an ecological perspective, and ecological problems must include a feminist perspective. The next slide. Cultural and radical or social ecofeminism are 2 different strands, 2 different in a way, ways of thinking ecofeminism. Cultural feminism incorporates symbology, drawing on religious mythical iconography, and it was present, you will see, in some early ecofeminist artworks. While radical or social ecofeminism, or maybe constructivist ecofeminism, we can call it, incorporates environmental activism and action. I don't see these 2 different streams as completely opposite or separate from each other. And I think that this was mainly the problem with the early criticism of ecofeminism. Maybe it was due to the powerful ideas of Judith Butler and her constructivism, but I think it was in a way misunderstood and misconstrued during these debates. Next slide. So I decided to make a map, actually, a kind of a metro map, underground map, where you can see this radical ecofeminism and cultural ecofeminism as starting or ending point of one metro line. But in a way, they are connected. You cannot go you cannot skip one or another. Next slide. And in the middle of it is the concept, is the problem of reproduction. And I will go back to this when we will discuss, next slide, concrete artworks. I don't have time to read all this, but you will be able to check all these authors later on. Next slide. Because they discussed more about all these different conflicts between different ways of understanding of the relation between environment and feminism, ecology, and gender, and so on and so forth. For tonight, it's enough if I say that cultural ecofeminists, next slide, encourage an association between women and the environment. They contend that women have a more intimate relationship with nature because of their gender roles, family nurturer and provider of food, and their biology, like menstruation, pregnancy, and lactation. Then the radical and social ecofeminists contend that the dominant patriarchal society equates nature and women in order to degrade both. So I would say that the radical and social feminists are more inclined to be political and activist, but at the same time, they do not completely reject the culture of feminism, I want to think. So in some of the early books, like The New Woman in 1975, Rosemary Rather warned us that women must see that there can be no liberation for them and no solution to the ecological crisis within a society whose fundamental model of relationship continues to be one of domination. And this is what informed my lecture. All these women are not here only to mourn or whine about the loss of nature or to restore the nature, but to research, to see with their own eyes what is the real reason for that. So in a way, it is informed by Marxism as a political philosophy, but at the same time with everyday life, with this neoliberal rampant building without taking account into the reality, into the soil, into the non-renewable energy. And maybe women are more equipped to understand this because their bodies and their gender actually has been exploited as if it was renewable without taking account of all these limits. Here I'm referring to Silvia Federici and her work on reproduction. It's something that actually Frigga Haug already announced in her 13th thesis of Marxism and feminism. I don't have much time to go through all these 13 theses, but basically, actually, it is really about the relations and the patriarchy and how ecofeminism, in fact, is indebted to this political philosophy. Next slide. Next slide. So I referred to bell hooks, who actually referred to class matters, and the issue of class is often completely absent from topics that deal with ecology. And I think that this is really something that we have to bear in mind. It's the promise, next slide, for example, the promise of equality, when Bell Hooks says the promise of equality is inevitably linked to the class issue and the necessity to thrive towards the society de-hierarchization. I read here ecofeminism. So nowadays, it's fashionable, she says, to talk about race or gender, but nobody wants to talk about class. And I share this content with her. Next slide. It's difficult to write all these complex Marxist concepts of political economy today in the context of ecofeminist art. We know about use value and exchange value. And this is one of the major problems when it comes to ecofeminism, that ecofeminists do not subscribe to this old Marxist concept that nature is here only to be exploited. And of course, human labor and surplus is heavily influenced by Marxist critique of political economy. The discourse on commodity, property, supply and demand, all these topics are somehow consisting can be found in ecofeminism. So these concepts are topical for understanding the contradictions between the means, forces, relations of reproduction, modes of production, and the distributing and redistributing of the capital. I don't have much time to talk about all these topics that are very complex, but you will see in the artworks, the artists always in a way have on mind the background of all these problems with the way how we treat nature. Therefore, the necessity of renewing the means of production to make production possible leads to the ultimate condition for production, the reproduction of the conditions of production. And this is what the artists have in mind, that you, by reproducing certain goods, by reproducing the means of production, the productive forces, you necessarily reproduce also the relations of production. And this is exactly what is in the core of this problem, the relations of production that are kind of multiplied and never addressed, never criticized. Next slide. Next slide. I think that I already went through this slide. Next slide. So you see, now I summarize all these topics that I already announced. They are subsumed by this topic of reproduction, because the problem with renewable energy, with renewable sources that is in the core of ecofeminism, in a way has to do with this reproduction, that we all keen to do it, but in a way without taking into account the limits of reproduction. And also the other problem that is completely Marxist, reproducing certain means of reproduction, we reproduce also the relations of reproduction that were already there and are in the core of the problem. Next slide. So we came to finally to the ecofeminism and art, our topic for tonight. Many feminist artists have pointed out the paradoxical position of the female procreativity, care, and other domestic reproductive activities, because they are all also subsumed by the term and topic of ecofeminism and ecofeminist art, that are simultaneous and unpaid counterpart to labor in the general productive sphere. I'm sorry for this heavy Marxist talk. I do have some kind of criticism, but at the same time, in a way, during this neoliberalist integration of women's reproduction and labor in production of goods, in contrast to capitalist gender-specific division of labor, we are somehow losing the core problem. In fact, that women are, in a way, hijacked, let's put it this way. They are appropriated, their labor is appropriated, and the criticism contained in ecofeminism cannot deal only with nature as such. This is something that even early ecofeminists were aware of, even though there was this tradition of ecofeminism that was very strong, that dealt with women as closer to nature, and this stream was heavily criticized as essentialist. Next slide. Here I list some of these relations between ecology, ecofeminism, topics like water rights and biodiversity, women at work, cleaning, maintenance, work and cooking, nursing, nurturing, organic food, plant, animal, earth, planetary care, motherhood, mother-child rearing, situated vernacular, hybrid knowledge. All these topics are part of feminist art. And this is where I come from. There is nothing to hide. Ecofeminism is only part of my kind of genuine work in in discussing feminist art and curating feminist art. The other topics are intertwined. I will not read because of time, but actually all these other topics are also intertwined with ecological topics. Next slide. I want to share with you my kind of admiration for the Cuban artist Ana Mendieta. I know that most of you know her work, and her work is difficult to systematize, to categorize. In art history, she goes by many different names. She was, in a way, anticipatory, because her work deals with body, with earth, Many feminists didn't really do justice. Critical feminist texts about her early work were not always positive. I think that it's very important to start with this work because actually it shows how feminists sometimes can be can miss the point, I must say. With this heavy criticism about the essentialist issue in Anna Mendieta's work, they missed the complexity of her work, and I really think that we owe to her some kind of apology. Next slide. I will here present some early works like Nancy Holt's Sand Tunnels, like Betty Beaumont, Ocean Landmarks, and not all this early ecofeminist work were successful in my view. Some of them were completely counterproductive, like Nancy Holt. I must say, when I see this concrete, uh, I have some cringes. It's really, in a way, to do something without harming what you try to do, for me is very ethical issue that not all artists succeed with. We had some similar kind of examples in Macedonia. I wanted to show them nevertheless, because actually they all these artists tried to address really important topics. Like Betty Beaumont's is, in my view, much more interesting because she deals with waste, with recycling waste that was used as a kind of prototype in the industry. Her work comprised of 17,000 coal fly ash blocks, and this is at the edge for me. You know, when I read 500 tons of processed coal waste, I am kind of at the same time intrigued, but also I see the issue here of some critiques. Next slide. Agnes dance with her rice tree burial with time capsule was a kind of more poetic. You know, she in a way wrote a letter to the future. And this early work from 1969 speaks volumes about the awareness of the artist of these topics that we struggle right now. She also made a work that was called Tree Mountain, also part of the time capsule. This message, next slide, this message with raising 11,000 trees with 11,000 people for 400 years. It's a very poetic, but at the same time ecological and activist work. 1992, it's too early to speak about ecological activism, but she did it, of course, with help of United Nations. It was sponsored by Finland, by her country, and this work for me sparks some other issues. To be honest, I admire the work. It's really ambitious, and it's right at the point. But the issue here is more of, you know, something that I have about art activism, where you have the nation, the national funding, the United Nations investing in this artwork, and at the same time ignoring these issues elsewhere. So the work itself is not problematic, but of course it reveals all this absurdity in contemporary politics. So next slide. I came across Aviva Rahman, her trigger point theory, and she is an artist, but also her theory is a kind of answer to the ecofeminist artist to the current ecological crisis. And it's really also early work. It was in the 1990s, exactly when all these debates that I mentioned and all this kind of turmoil and conflicts between different ecofeminist started. In a way, she re-established the ecosystem buffer zone with her work that was all about clean water. She mapped, next slide. In her work Ghost Nest, she actually worked a lot in Gulf of Maine with the lack of clean water, and she mapped, she researched all these problems with clean water, which at the same time brings me to something that I wanted to mention all the time, that ecofeminist artists were women that were invested in research art before research art became so hip as it is today. So most of these works were based on tedious research of the environmental issues. So you can see this is maybe one of the best examples of Aviva Rahman. Now I want to go to other topics that is more about patriarchy, and next slide. And they show here the work by Sanja Ivekovic, Attention Women at Work. And this is exactly, and then you can read care for women, for children, ironing and cooking, all these stereotypical patriarchal notions of what women should do. But at the same time, the sign shows a woman doing some heavy duty work, unpaid labor in the household, like care for children or ironing and cooking. This work could be illustration for Silvia Federici's books in the front page. Now I have to ask you to bear with me to tell you a little bit more about my background and how I came to feminism. Of course, I was interested in the discourse of feminism, in the politics of it, and at the same time philosophy of it. But you know, in 2002, when I already had several exhibitions that dealt with feminist issues and gender issues with patriarchy, like Capital and Gender was one of the biggest public projects dealing with this topic. There was a debate, next slide, there was the first feminist debate in Macedonia, which was mainly kind of taking place on the pages of forum. Next slide. And these texts that were published during 3 months were mainly written by men, and they suggested that the only place that woman has in the society is the place to bear children, or to quote exactly the terms that were used was snugging, bed ability, nestling. These were the terms written by philosophers, classic philosophers, linguists, and also one art historian, Nebojša Vilić, who wrote the text Tights and G-strings, which was completely misogynist, I would say. So this is the background why I feel so strongly about all these topics, that it's not by accident, it's not just academic rehearsal for me, but in a way, ecofeminism comes as an answer to this kind of I don't want to use very heavy words, but let's put it this way, this masculine understanding of the world as inhabited by men and women, but the women have a kind of place just to reproduce the humanity. I was too mild. Next slide. I collaborated from 1994 till today, I must say, with the artist Violeta Čapolska, who lives in Australia but was born in Macedonia. And her projects from 1994 till today were all taking place in the mountain next to Bitola, my hometown, in the top, the peak of the mountain, where there is a little lake. Next slide. we climbed there, and that was one of my first curatorial projects. It's 1,200 meters height. It's one of the best preserved lakes in Macedonia, and it stayed this way because the artist was Violeta Čakovska, is very concerned with entropy and also with the harm that art can do to nature. So these land print projects were done without any waste, without any kind of intervention in the nature. It was only the artist who took some stones and made prints later at home, but her performance was this land print project. Recently, 1 year ago, she came back and she did another project which was called Salt. And now I cannot go into details, but it is one, you have to take my word. It's one of these projects that are completely dedicated to the relation between the female body, identity, and nature. Next slide. Next slide. Forest Law is a long-term project by Ursula Biermann in collaboration with Paulo Tavares. She's an artist that I could not really ignore or overlook because she invested a lot of energy and time and research into Ecuadorian Amazon. And she is looking at the relation between the exploitation of nature, capitalism, colonization of nature, and empires, different empires that somehow exploit nature of other ethnicities without taking into account that in this way they endanger the species, but at the same time the people who inhabit this nature. I don't have much time to go in details because this is really long-term projects that Ursula Biermann invests in. You can find lots of materials online. She was invited to make a project in Sao Paulo recently, so she is working on this project right now. Next slide. You can see here projects from different years, but she works on one project for 10 years, for example, because all this research takes time. And when she makes this research, sometimes she includes a lot of scientists in the teams, and they produce reports as artwork. Next slide. Some of these artists are architects because the architects understand very well how to deal with nature and what is the problem, but at the same time some architects that are not so aware of it destroy nature. Marietta Potric is not one of them. She is really invested in coexistence, in collaboration, in participation. She works a lot with the children, and she is an architect from Slovenia, but she works everywhere and deals with water. Recently dealt with water also as highly charged topic on locally in Slovenia and elsewhere. The most recent project from Biennial in Sydney is dealing with Sucha River in Slovenia and Lachin River in Australia. So I came to a project that is very close to my heart. Next slide, which is a project by a Finnish artist, Maretana Sara. It was exhibited in Documenta 14. I didn't discover it, but I've written a lot about Sami people and Sami reindeers in Finland without knowing so much about her work. So it was really great coincidence when I came across this project with which deals with the struggle of the Sami. I don't know if you know, this is a minority from Finland, reindeers, herders in Norway. That is one of the relevant example. It's one of these designated Norwegian area, which lost lots of rights to their own land and to working there, and also capturing reindeers. It's a very complex issue because if you think about reindeers, actually it's not easy to make this discussion and to make this argument for Sami people, but the country itself, the Norwegian government, in a way, made a horrible mistake without including Sami people into their decisions made about the land rights, about hunt of reindeers, and about exploiting of the land and the reindeers themselves. So it's really about coloniality, but not in terms of foreign powers, but the country itself, the national colonialism over the Sami land. Next slide. I will end now. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit over time. I will end with the work by Elizabeth von Samsonov, Hybrid Knowledge. And you can see that hybrid was one of the terms in my title. The symposium against the method was one of the performances that I encountered, that I attended in Vienna, in Generali Foundation, where Elizabeth von Samsonov, together with the musician Ida Maria Corral, collaborated and performed a kind of hybrid lecture where she used some of her sculptures as props, but at the same time she gave a lecture about hybrid knowledges and against the methodology. During the performance general practice, the artist, next slide. This is the slide that I talked about, the lecture of hybrid knowledge. And the next slide is the performance general practice, where she cross-dressed. Elizabeth von Samsonov is professor of anthropology, I must say, but she's an artist, and she cross-dresses as statues of trees or animals. Here you can see she dressed as a grass dress, and you can say that maybe she's closer to this early feminist works where artist identifies with the land. But I can say that this is exactly the problem with the criticism of early ecofeminism, that they overlook actually the complexity of this work. Next slide. And here you can see Elizabeth von Samsonov discussing this ventriloquism, which is speaking for the others. It stands for speaking for nature, for earth, from our own perspective. And this is in a way as a kind of circle with the first slide that I read, this quotation about how anthropocentric we are, how we look at nature as only through our eyes, as only something to be exploited. And now we are in panic because we exploited everything and we go to Mars next time to exploit Mars or the moon. And this is exactly where my criticism lays. So this is why I accepted this invitation to address these issues, because I'm at the same time critical, but also interested, intrigued, curious about artworks by women artists who criticize this kind of anthropocentric view of the world. The artist Elizabeth von Samsonov is one of the most articulated artists who deals with this hybrid knowledge. She calls for hybrid knowledge, which means to put together our knowledge about ourselves and about nature, about the plants, about the animals. And this was one of the earliest critique of ecofeminism, that they were against the using of fur, for example. Now it sounds like obsolete criticism that they dealt with animals and plants on the same level as with humans, but this is why we have to go back to the past, to history, and to research more about these early works. It is an open question how many, which, and on what grounds any of the various positions in environmental philosophy and art and ecology that acknowledge feminist concerns or claim to be feminist, whether they are properly identified as ecofeminist positions. But I must say this is also a kind of masculine understanding of all these definitions, that everything has to be mathematically, rationally discussed and analyzed. And I invite you to think about ecofeminism with other eyes, much more open, wider open. What one takes to be a genuine ecofeminist position will depend largely on how one conceptualizes both feminism and ecofeminism and life at the end. So thank you very much for staying with me and following this lecture. This is the next slide is the end. Next slide. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzana, for this beautiful lecture. I just want to tell you what was happening behind on the technical stage. Actually, we had some technical issues or limitations of viewing of the lecture streaming. We could have seen like 20 people could access, but many people were writing over on Lokomotiva saying that they couldn't access the link. So there is something which was happening, but anyhow, we said that we will have the possibility to stream this, actually to post the YouTube channel, but also to share it through our page and also through the page of Kai Theater. But also those who wanted to participate maybe in Q&A will have the possibility, as Agnes introduced, to listen to the talks with the next lecturer, where you will also participate and maybe have the opportunity to ask you there. However, we have this rare opportunity now to ask you a bit more. And we will see out of those people who could access now the link, if there are any questions. But I'm curious maybe to ask you, because there are many things. I mean, I have different notes, and you brought a lot of diverse directions through what one can explore further the subject. But what at the end actually struck me, it was you talked about the critics of the ecofeminism, and can we know more about the critics of ecofeminism today? Because you mentioned it now at the end, but also before, and you were saying that we should explore what was done before. We should go back in the history and maybe relate to what was happening. Can you say a bit more about that?
Biljana, it's really important and it's still a relevant question, because I think a lot about centers of power of discourses. And, you know, we live in North Macedonia, and as it was in this debate in 1992, when it was already very late to discuss these issues, I'm sure that even today there are lots of artists, even including women, who do not have full understanding of all these topics. This is why I took you to a journey back in the 60s, 70s in theory and art, because I think that some of these issues have been discussed, but not all artists have access to this knowledge. Not all artists are informed by this. I doubt that there is ecofeminist course in Macedonia being taught anywhere. So many women artists that I came across who are good artists, when they decide to address these issues, in a way, they produce some naive works which go even contrary to the main definitions or assumptions of ecofeminism. And this is why they become vulnerable to criticism, because the critique is mainly to the artists that deal with this naive assumption that women are closer to nature. So therefore, there must be ecofeminists or ecology aware. This is not so simple. And at the same time, also, if you do projects, I don't want to name names, but if you make projects in order to celebrate nature, and then you put concrete in water, something is wrong with this. It's really the assumption that ecology is only a kind of metaphor. Ecology is not a metaphor. There is science behind it. And this denialism, which we became aware, recent denialism in the States, it exists in much more hidden way here. By celebrating nature and then put it, tons of concrete in the same very nature that you want to protect, you somehow make a counterpoint, and you become really dangerous. So it's not purity and danger in terms of Mary Douglas, where the natural secretions of women are this impurity or dangers, but actually it's kind of famous artist really endangering nature. So I'm very critical about it, because you know that I work a lot with Romani artists, and I've learned one thing that I took from this experience was do not do more harm than good when you maybe your intentions are really good, but you have to be aware what your activity does to the people or nature that you're supposedly defending or wanting to preserve. This is why I mentioned about Violeta Čaputska works, that even so early in 1994 she was so careful not to leave anything in the little lake. When we climbed at the top and when we went back, there was nothing left there. Everything that was used for her artwork was natural, and there were no residues. This notion of entropy in art is a huge issue, and not many people talk about this. But if you think about waste, art production is in a way generating this ways that nobody discusses, and we talk about this fancy ecology, ecofeminist works, but at the same time many of these artworks produce more waste and endanger the very same nature that they're supposed to protect. So this is the criticism, but of course you're aware of Judith Butler's idea of constructivism, and many art theorists took this, I would say, too superficial, too mathematically rational, and tried to apply it to everywhere, criticizing early ecofeminists for essentialism, for thinking that some of his works were, to be honest, essentialist. Assume that actually women are just more natural, closer to nature, as our colleagues did in 1992 in this famous feminist debate about leglovnost, if you remember. They tried to coin this term leglovnost, which means that women are, this is our role in society, just to rear children. And this is how we act. We dress provocatively just because this is why we were born, you know, to make, to produce more children, to reproduce more children. So I'm trying, you know, to comprise my, to put together my own experiences from this very heavily patriarchal society, and my knowledge, my information from elsewhere. But trust me, we are not the most patriarchal society. Similar issues are elsewhere in the academic, in artistic circles. So this is why I admire these women that dedicate their works to such important and urgent issues with knowledge and with research, not only with metaphors and myths, symbols, as these early ecofeminists were doing.
Thank you, Suzana. There is one question in the audience, but I would like to ask Agnes if she would like maybe also to comment or to give a question at this moment, and then we can go with the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susanna, for this lecture and for the beautiful examples you brought. I was also I was processing all this information, and I was wondering, since you were mentioning that those questions of ecofeminism are also linked to patriarchy and to the position of women and their invisible reproductive labor, how those questions were also sitting for you with racism, decolonialism, and other inequalities that we can also see in our society, and how this how this is also talking with class and Marxism. It's just maybe very broad.
Agnes, you read my mind. I didn't have enough time. I quickly mentioned my work with Romani community, you know, and this is the first thing that came to my mind when you started the question about race, because, you know, we live in Eastern Europe, where the notion of race is kind of neglected, ignored, because it's assumed that it doesn't affect us, you know, that it's elsewhere, it's far away, it's about African American problems, it's about indigenous people in Australia or New Zealand. But of course, if you look closer, we have this huge Romani population that was affected the most by this pandemic to start with, but also by this not having rights to their land. And all these topics, you know, I came through my curatorial work, need to be addressed much more, you know, because they're urgent. The people, I don't know if you know about this, that the people who inhabited land in Macedonia with Romania origin, they hardly ever have property documents, you know, and this makes easier to neoliberal governments to kick them out of their land. And this is about, you know, it's related to to ecology and environment issues, because they are sometimes seen as polluting in the environment. But of course, if they don't have the right to education, to medication, to social security, to jobs, you know, this is not their problem if they pollute, you know. It's really much more complex. And when we talk about race, I always think first to on this Romani population in Macedonia, for example. It's the biggest community in Skopje of almost 60,000 people who live in impossible living conditions in Šutorizari, you know. And even intellectuals, artists, they often say, oh, but they like to live like this. They are these nomadic people, wanderlust, that like to travel, and you know, this is how they live. And this is the stereotypical understanding of Romani people, that they are always in movement. Even in history, there are sedimentary Roma people that like to have their house, their home, their job, but they're not treated equally in the society. And I think that the environmental issues in Eastern Europe have to do something with these non-urbanized communities, that are often left alone, left to even to die, during the pandemic. If you think about vaccination, for example, or tests, or they don't have the access to all this, and then you judge, the society judges them as dirty. Speaking of this, topic, my lecture, the title, they are also seen as women in a way, in this anthropological sense, and this is the maybe the biggest stereotype still in Europe, not only in Eastern Europe, that prevails, that is not fully addressed or discussed. And then, when we talk about race, we say there is no structural racism, there is no systemic racism in Macedonia, but there is, and it's in the middle of Skopje where we live. So thank you very much for this question, because I couldn't really address this during my lecture, but somehow you triggered me to talk about something that I'm fully engaged with in my curatorial work. The question of
Thank you.
caravans. I've written several texts about this. Biljana, what was the other question?
We don't hear you, Biljana. Your microphone is muted, apparently.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now you can
yes.
hear me. Okay. Okay, sometimes. I said there is a question by a colleague, Marijana Cvetković from Belgrade. She says, thank you, Suzana. The lecture was brilliant. Where do you see possibilities to situate the ecofeminist views on class in the alternative political movement programs? What is the specific way of ecofeminism for practical political interventions? And do you have any references in the field of performing arts that you would like to emphasize?
Thank you so much, Marijana, for the question. As I said, I didn't have time to go through all the examples. Of course, we know the works by Tanja Ostojić, who invested a lot in solidarity. I was deeply involved in this project, the Lexicon of Tanja Ostojić, that gathered women that all have the same name, but they are from different ex-Yugoslav republics. They live in different countries, and maybe during the interviews with these women in the book that she published, we can discuss about this future about of the precariat, because actually she included interviews with 30 women that all had similar problems after the split of Yugoslavia, exactly with these precariat conditions. And to go back to the first part of your question, I started with the end, with the example. To go to the first part, I think that there is no other word that expresses better what is in front of us. The only answer that I can have is the solidarity, actually, and solidarity not with the similar. I must say that I stress the term similarity with the different, not solidarity as such, but solidarity with the different is really important. When I was talking about Romani people, for example, when I am talking about ecofeminist, ecofeminism is a political action for me. Artists that deal with it, they have to accept that ecofeminism is a political position. And at the same time, we need to always acknowledge the privilege from which we speak in order to be able to make this bridge between us and the less privileged, with the disenfranchised. And this is where I see the future of ecofeminism. So I would lobby for solidarity with the different. You know, when I came back from Austria in Macedonia, I was eager to collaborate. But from what I've seen, it's so rare that this collaboration takes place between different camps. You know, I spent all my work and my career towards working with the different. And now I see that, art circles are as elitist as when I left. Nothing much changed. So we all live in and work with, I don't exclude myself, don't get me wrong. We all live in some small clans, you know, and work within these small circles. We do not allow the full participation of the communities because the money is too little, or the places are too little, the jobs are too little, whatever. There are always excuses. But I would I would lobby for this solidarity with the different, not speaking on behalf of the different, not discussing about Roma people, you know, including them and working together with them in solidarity with them. I don't have tools, I don't have institution, I don't have money, but I do have some ideas that I'm ready to share. And as you know, sometimes I get paid, but when I work with other communities, I often offer my services for exactly these theoretical discussions in solidarity with them. So knowing know-how is really important. I think that we need to share a little bit more. So solidarity and intersectionality are the key terms for me. I'm not sure whether I answered Mariana's question, but I think that Agnes' question about race and this question about precariat and living conditions and the future of ecofeminists are really the core of my lecture. I didn't address them directly, so I'm grateful that you gave me time and possibility to address them in the follow-up.
Thank you, Suzana. There is one question more that I would like to share, and maybe we can take it as the last one and we can finish soon. It's by Sofia Grigoriadou. She says, thank you, Suzana. Unfortunately, I missed last large part of the lecture due to bad connectivity. Therefore, I hope I don't ask something you have already responded to. Could you develop more on the concept of purity and danger through some of the examples you showed, or others, any of them that directly or indirectly respond to the notion of purity and danger in critical way?
I must explain, Sophia, maybe you missed this, that I took this title as a kind of more, not only metaphor, but also pun to the more recent discourses about the pure and the pollution and the hybrid. I didn't really address the anthropological issue of Mary Douglas, purity and danger, the view, the anthropological view of women as dangerous because they pollute. This for me was a kind of interesting contradiction, because as I said in my abstract, as I announced in my abstract, on the one hand, you see the woman as a kind of dirty, and someone who pollutes, who is in certain periods of her life dangerous because she pollutes, and at the same time you expect from her to do the heavy duty cleaning and work at home. And this contradiction was on the basis of in the basis of my question, but I agree, I didn't really reflect on this more deeply in the lecture and in the examples, because actually I moved from this notion from the past, this anthropological stereotype of women as dangerous and polluting and dirty, towards more recent understanding and discourses of ecofeminists that are not so invested, let's say, in this kind of metaphorical understanding or anthropological understanding of women as close to nature or natural. I'm afraid of going back to this kind of works exactly because of these inner contradictions that could be maybe again criticized for essentialism. Because in fact one needs to do more research. Some of these ecofeminist texts, for example, are so rich that I'm really surprised with this criticism that I inherited, on a superficial level. I need some time to think about proper examples, but we can stay in touch and think about this, together to find more appropriate examples. Sometimes in the work by Elizabeth von Samsonov, I've heard also criticism because she, but this is more on level of medium, because she intertwines handmade works with lectures, with objects, found objects, and for some art historians that are all about purity in terms of media, these works are dirty. And this is me speaking as an art historian, as a critique that I was also trained in this formalist tradition of art history. And for a very long time, I couldn't really fully accept ecofeminist works. I'm honest, as a student, I was all about these huge paintings by male artists, that were monochromous and, very formal and abstract. It was very difficult to make the leap because art history, art criticism, art, biennials, everything was on that side, and I was just a humble student, in a way, accepting all this knowledge without having any alternative. It took me really a while to, take this distance and to understand what is wrong with this view, with these dangerous women that make art that sounds kind of anthropological, as anthropological ritual, for example, like in Elizabeth von Samsonov's work. We do have the artist Aneta Svetieva, that was for a very long time undervalued also, and even Anna Temkova, because they all created works that were informed by their femininity, and they were in a way undermined in art history for a very long time. Sophia, we can stay in touch and think for better examples together.
Thank you, Suzana. You have also thanks from the audience in the thread. Well, I think since it's 9:30, nearly in 3 minutes, it's becoming 9:30. I would like to ask you that we finish. If anything else you would like to ask Agnes or Suzanne, if you want to add something. If not,
I like to say one thing at the end. I like to thank to all women that were so invested in organizing this lecture. that some of you I know for years, some of you I've just met, but this feminine energy, you know, there is nothing wrong about this kind of essentialism. I hate the term, you know, it gave way to all these masculine philosophers to somehow play with that, and just often even women misunderstood it. So let's go beyond this. This is my kind of letter for the future.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Suzana,
you.
Biljana.
Thank you, Agnes. Thank you so much, Suzana. I just want to thank also to my colleagues Zorica Zafirovska, Nina Tonkin from Lokomotiva, and Stan Spikers, who tried to solve these also technical issues. Thanks a lot. And just to announce that this recording will be available, so also there will be a continuation of this conversation planned in future with Kai. Thanks a lot.
Thank
And
you.
have a great evening.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Very
you.
much.
Bye-bye.